A fisherman off the coast of Crete swore his net snagged a stone column 40 feet down. A pearl diver in the Gulf of Kutch described paved roads running under the tide. A Roman senator wrote about a resort town that slid into the sea in a single night, and nobody who read him believed a word of it. Historians called all three superstition. Coastlines don't swallow whole cities. No serious geographer charts a place that isn't there. They were wrong 31 times over. What you're about to see are 31 ancient cities that sailors mapped as legend, until side-scan sonar drew the streets in straight lines no current could carve. A Roman spa where senators once bathed, now photographed by divers row by row. A gold-stelae temple buried under Nile silt for 2,000 years. A 3,500-year-old town, paved stone by stone, sitting 4 meters under the Aegean, older than any submerged settlement ever surveyed. Every one of them was filed under myth. The seabed disagreed. 31 drowned ports. 31 dismissals. One pattern that repeats from Greece to Wales to the Bay of Bengal. The story was true, the proof was underwater, and the mistake was calling it a story in the first place. Number 1 starts where the pattern started. 1. Off the southern tip of Laconia, Greek fishermen had talked for generations about a shape they could see through clear water near Pavlopetri, a rectangular grid, too regular to be rock. Local guides pointed tourists to it as a curiosity, nothing more. Archaeologists who bothered to look assumed it was a Roman-era breakwater, maybe a few hundred years old, not worth a proper survey. In 1967, oceanographer Nicholas Fleming took a first pass with a tape measure and a notepad and came back with something nobody expected. Streets, courtyards, and roughly 15 buildings laid out in a grid pattern consistent with Bronze Age town planning. It sat under 3 to 4 meters of water, close enough to touch without diving gear. The full mapping didn't happen until 2009, when a University of Nottingham team led by John Henderson used acoustic and laser-based survey tools to chart the site tile by tile. The results pushed the town's age back roughly 3,500 years, older than any known submerged town on Earth, complete with a possible megaron hall and rock-cut tombs cut before the site ever went under. Nobody built Pavlopetri underwater. The Mediterranean rose around it, slowly, over centuries, and swallowed a working Bronze Age port whole. The grid the fishermen saw wasn't a breakwater. It was somebody's street. 2. Ptolemaic sailors navigating the mouth of the Nile knew a port called Thonis by name, the customs gateway where Greek merchant ships paid their toll before entering Egypt. Ancient writers described its temple to Amun, its canals, its wealth. Then the references stopped. By the time European scholars went looking in the 1900s, most concluded Thonis was either a poetic exaggeration or the same city as Heracleion, mentioned separately by Herodotus, and that both had simply been swallowed by geography that no longer matched any map. In 2000, French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio was surveying Abu Ghirbe near Alexandria when his team's magnetometer readings turned up something too large to be seabed debris. Excavation over the following years pulled up a 5-meter red granite stele bearing a royal decree, colossal statues of a pharaoh and his queen, and gold jewelry still sitting where it had settled over 1,000 years earlier. The inscriptions on the stele named the city twice, Thonis and Heracleion, the same place, 2 names for one port that Greek and Egyptian sailors had simply called by different tongues. Soil liquefaction from earthquakes and a rising Mediterranean had dragged the entire district under the bay sometime around the 8th century. The city scholars split into 2 separate myths turned out to be a single real place, 12 meters under Abu Ghirbe the whole time. 3. Along India's Gujarat coast, local tradition placed the mythic city of Dwarka, ruled by Krishna, somewhere beneath the waves of the Arabian Sea after the god's death triggered its collapse into the ocean. For most of the 20th century, Indian archaeologists treated the story as devotional literature, not a sight brief. Krishna's city was scripture, not surveying data. The Marine Archaeology Unit of India's National Institute of Oceanography began diving the coastal waters off modern Dwarka in the 1980s, led by S.R. Rao. Underwater surveys turned up stone anchors, fortification walls, and pottery consistent with a settlement dated to roughly 1500 BCE, sitting submerged just offshore from the current town. Separately, and more controversially, a 2001 sonar survey of the Gulf of Kampat, further south, picked up geometric structures on the seabed at a depth of nearly 40 meters, alongside a wooden fragment that one lab dated to over 9,000 years old. That claim split the archaeological community hard. Some researchers call it the oldest submerged settlement ever detected. Others argue the sonar returns are natural rock formation and the dated wood could be driftwood, not architecture. Dwarka's Temple City remains one of underwater archaeology's genuine live disputes. The anchors and walls off the coast are real and dated. Whether they're Krishna's city is a question the sonar hasn't settled yet. 4. Roman writers gossiped about Baiae the way modern tabloids cover a resort town for the wealthy. Bathhouses, private villas, and a reputation loose enough that the poet Sextus Propertius called it a haven of vice. What ancient sources didn't spell out in detail was how the town eventually vanished from the map almost entirely, its ruins sinking beneath the Bay of Naples over the following centuries. For a long stretch, local historians assumed erosion had simply worn Baiae's coastal buildings down to rubble, the ordinary fate of an abandoned Roman town, nothing more dramatic than time. The real cause was Bradyseism, the slow rise and fall of ground level, driven by volcanic activity beneath the Campi Flegrei caldera. As the land sank across the early medieval period, entire districts of Baiae slid under the bay while staying largely intact, protected from the crumbling wind erosion had inflicted on ruins left on dry land. Divers with the Parco Archeologico Sommerso de Baia now swim through mosaic floors, columned courtyards, and a nymphaeum built for the Emperor Claudius, all sitting between 4 and 6 meters down in water, clear enough to photograph without dredging. Baiae didn't fall into ruin. It sank into preservation. The bay did what erosion never could. It kept the floor plan intact. 5. English colonial records from the 17th century described Port Royal, Jamaica, as the wealthiest port in the Western Hemisphere, a boomtown of merchants, privateers, and taverns built on reclaimed sand at the mouth of Kingston Harbor. Then, on June 7, 1692, a massive earthquake liquefied the sandy foundation the town sat on, and roughly 2/3 of Port Royal dropped straight into the harbor within minutes, killing an estimated 2,000 people instantly. For centuries afterward, the Sunken district was treated as a colorful pirate legend, a drowned den of iniquity more suited to tavern stories than serious excavation. Few institutions saw value in funding a dig on a town best known for rum and buccaneers. That changed when Texas A&M University archaeologist Donnie Hamilton led systematic excavations starting in the 1980s, mapping building foundations, brick streets, and everyday objects frozen in place by the speed of the collapse, including a pocket watch stopped at 11:43. The exact minute records say the quake struck. Port Royal wasn't wiped away. It was flash frozen mid-collapse, and the watch proved the hour. 6. Villagers around Qiandao Lake in China's Zhejiang province grew up with stories about an older town buried somewhere beneath the reservoir, a place their grandparents remembered before the valley was dammed. Because the flooding was recent and deliberate, engineers who built the reservoir in 1959 treated the submerged town as infrastructure, not heritage, a place to be forgotten on purpose. Xicheng, the Lion City, had stood at the base of Wuxi Mountain for nearly 1,300 years before China's Xinan River hydroelectric project flooded the valley to create the reservoir, submerging the entire walled city under roughly 40 meters of water without any large-scale archaeological survey beforehand. Chinese diving teams didn't properly document the site until 2001, and what they found stunned them. 5 city gates, stone lions, dragon carvings, and an entire network of streets still standing, largely undamaged by decades underwater because the lake's still sediment-free conditions acted almost like a sealed vault. Xicheng wasn't lost to myth. It was lost to a dam and a shrug, until divers went down and found a Tang Dynasty city that time, or rather the reservoir, had barely touched it all. 7. Fishermen near Yonaguni Island, at the southwestern edge of Japan's Ryukyu chain, had long reported strange stepped formations on the seafloor, terraces too regular for casual glances. Marine geologists who heard the reports assumed ordinary sandstone erosion, the same forces that carve natural terraces on dry land, just underwater. In 1986, a local dive tour operator named Kihachiro Aratake found a massive rock formation roughly 25 meters down, featuring flat terraces, sharp right angles, and what looked like a staircase carved into the stone. Japanese researcher Masaki Kimura began surveying the site and became convinced it was man-made, dating it to a period before the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough for the area to be dry land. The claim ignited a genuine scientific fight that's still unresolved. Geologists, including Robert Schoch, have argued the formation's straight edges and right angles are consistent with natural sandstone fracturing along bedding planes, a process seen in unmodified rock elsewhere in the region, no human tools required. Yonaguni remains the rare entry on this list where the sonar and the divers agree on what's down there and disagree completely on who built it. 8. Alexandrian tour guides in antiquity pointed visiting sailors toward the shoreline near the old royal harbor and described palaces where Cleopatra Vet once lived, structures that had simply vanished by the time Arab and later European travelers arrived to look for them. Most assumed the palaces had been dismantled for building material over the centuries, stone by stone, the ordinary fate of an abandoned capital. Frank Gaudio's team, the same group that later found Thonis Heracleion, began surveying Alexandria's eastern harbor in 1996 using sonar and magnetic imaging. What emerged from the silt was a submerged district roughly 6.5 hectares wide, containing columns, sphinxes, and building foundations consistent with the royal quarters described by the Greek geographer Strabo 2,000 years earlier. A combination of earthquakes and the same land subsidence that later swallowed Baiae had dropped the entire promontory into the harbor sometime in the 4th to 8th century CE, taking Cleopatra's palace complex with it, still largely intact under 6 to 8 meters of water just off the modern Alexandria waterfront. The palaces weren't dismantled. They were dropped whole into the harbor they once overlooked, and the map that finally located them was written by a Greek geographer 2 millennia before sonar existed. 9. Roman-era travelers wrote about Canopus as a hedonistic Nile Delta town near Alexandria, famous for its temple to Serapis and a canal-side nightlife that made even Baiae look tame by comparison. Like Thonis, it dropped out of reliable record after antiquity, and 19th century Egyptologists working from fragmentary texts genuinely disagreed about whether Canopus, Heracleion, and Meneuches were 3 separate towns or garbled retellings of the same place. Frank Gaudio's Abu Qir Bay surveys settled a good part of that confusion. Canopus turned up as its own distinct site, separate from Thonis Heracleion, with its own temple precinct, harbor structures, and a scatter of votive objects tied to the cult of Serapis and Isis. Sediment cores from the bay floor confirmed what ancient geographers had hinted at for centuries. A combination of Nile flooding, soil liquefaction, and gradual coastal subsidence had pulled the entire delta shoreline underwater in stages between the 3rd and 8th centuries. 3 towns argued over for a century turned out to be exactly 3 towns, sitting a few hundred meters apart on the same drowned stretch of coast, precisely where the old geographers said they'd be. 10. A fishing village on the western coast of the Peloponnese held on to stories about an older harbor town, Phaia, that had once served as the port Homer mentioned in the Odyssey, a stopover for ships headed toward Pylos. Classical scholars debated the reference for generations without much physical evidence to settle the argument either way, treating Phaia as a plausible but unproven Homeric location. Greek underwater archaeologists surveying the coast near modern Katakolo in the 2000s located submerged harbor walls, building foundations, and ceramic fragments spanning from the Mycenaean period through Roman times, sitting just off the current shoreline in shallow water. Geological analysis pointed to repeated seismic activity along a coastline that sits directly on an active fault system, gradually lowering sections of the ancient port below sea level across multiple earthquake events rather than one dramatic collapse. Phaia wasn't a poetic flourish in an old epic. It was a real working harbor, and the ground under it kept dropping until the sea finally caught up with the story. 11. On the eastern coast of Crete, near the modern town of Elaunda, older residents described a drowned town called Aulis that had supposedly once housed a temple to Britomartis, visible through the shallows on a calm day. 19th century travelers who noted the submerged walls generally assumed they were looking at a minor Roman-era ruin, unremarkable and unworth excavating. 20th century surveys identified Aulis as a substantial Hellenistic and Roman city-state, once minting its own coinage and maintaining a defensive wall system, portions of which now sit just below the surface in Elaunda's shallow bay, visible to snorkelers on clear days without any special equipment. Coastal subsidence tied to regional tectonic shifts, the same broad forces reshaping much of the eastern Mediterranean seabed, lowered Aulis gradually rather than in a single catastrophic event, preserving mosaic floors that archaeologists later documented in a submerged early Christian basilica near the ancient city's edge. Aulis never needed sonar to find it. It needed someone to stop, assuming what was visible under 3 feet of water wasn't worth a second look. 12. Fishermen working the Carmel coast of Israel occasionally hauled up worked stone in their nets, flint tools, and once, reportedly, human bone fragments, results they treated as bad luck and threw back rather than reported. Israeli marine archaeologists in the mid-20th century had no reason to expect a Neolithic village that far offshore. Stone Age settlements belonged on land, not 12 metras under the Mediterranean. In 1984, marine archaeologist Ehud Galili was surveying the seabed near Atlit for shipwrecks when he spotted stone structures protruding from the sediment. Excavation revealed Atlit Yam, a roughly 9,000-year-old Neolithic village complete with stone-built houses, a well, and a striking megalithic stone circle interpreted as a ritual site, along with skeletal remains showing signs of tuberculosis, among the earliest documented cases of the disease anywhere in the world. Rising sea levels following the last ice age, not a single flood event, had submerged the settlement gradually over roughly 1,000 years, drowning an entire working village along with the freshwater spring that had originally drawn people there to live. Atlit Yam wasn't a myth anyone told. It was a village nobody thought to look for, sitting quietly underwater for 9 millennia until a shipwreck survey happened to pass directly over it. 13. Medieval North Sea fishermen occasionally dredged up mammoth bones and worked flint tools in trawl nets, oddities they generally sold as curiosities without asking why Stone Age tools kept turning up in open water between Britain and the European mainland. For most of the 20th century, geologists knew the southern North Sea had once been dry land, but treated it as an empty landmass, not a place people had actually lived and built on in any organized way. Beginning in the 1990s, oil and gas companies conducting seismic surveys of the North Sea floor for drilling purposes inadvertently generated detailed maps of an ancient landscape now known as Doggerland, a region of rivers, lakes, and low hills that connected Britain to continental Europe until roughly 6,500 BCE, when rising post-glacial seas and a catastrophic tsunami triggered by the Storegga slide submerged it for good. University of Bradford researchers later used the repurposed survey data, plus dredged artifacts, including a Mesolithic barbed antler point found by a trawler in 1931, to reconstruct river systems and likely settlement zones across an area now roughly the size of the Netherlands, once home to thousands of hunter-gatherers. Doggerland wasn't legend, and it wasn't empty. It was a country, fully inhabited, that the sea took in a single catastrophic afternoon and thousands of quieter years afterward. 14. Along Germany's North Frisian coast, local tradition kept alive a story about Rungholt, a wealthy trading town on the island of Strand that supposedly drowned overnight during a monstrous storm in 1362, later folded into legend as punishment for the town's greed and moral decay. For centuries, historians treated the tale the way they'd treat any morality fable, a story with a lesson attached, not a place with coordinates. The Grote Mandrenki, a massive storm surge that struck the North Sea coast in January 1362, genuinely did reshape the entire Wadden Sea region, drowning multiple settlements and permanently altering the coastline of what's now Schleswig-Holstein. German archaeologists using aerial photography and later magnetometer surveys of the Wadden Sea mudflats in the 2000s and 2010s located extensive building foundations, a church, dike systems, and pottery fragments dated precisely to the 14th century, confirming a real, substantial settlement sat exactly where the storm legend placed it. The moral fable about a greedy town punished by the sea turned out to have an actual town underneath it, sitting in the mud at low tide, waiting on a magnetometer survey to prove the storm hadn't been invented to teach anyone a lesson. 15. Ancient Greek writers described Relic as a prosperous city on the Corinthian Gulf, home to a major temple of Poseidon, until the entire settlement vanished in a single catastrophic night in 373 BCE. Roman-era authors like Pausanias and Strabo recorded the disaster in detail, and for centuries afterward, Relic sat at the edge of the Atlantis legend itself, cited by some as a possible real-world inspiration for Plato's story. Because the site was described as visible underwater by classical travelers, but couldn't be relocated by 19th or early 20th century archaeologists, many scholars concluded the ancient accounts had exaggerated, or the city's remains had simply eroded away entirely, an unrecoverable footnote. Greek archaeologist Dora Katsinopoulou began systematic excavation in the 1990s and, after years of survey work, determined that Relic hadn't stayed underwater at all. A tsunami had submerged it briefly, then river sediment from the nearby Selinus and Karenites rivers buried the ruins on land over the following centuries, shifting the search from seabed to coastal plain. Excavations since then have uncovered building foundations, a Roman-era street grid, and early Bronze Age structures beneath the later classical city. Relic taught underwater archaeology its most useful lesson. Sometimes the drowned city doesn't stay drowned. Sometimes the sea gives the land its ruins back, buried, and everyone was searching in the wrong element. 16. Along Turkey's Lycian coast, sailors navigating near the village of Kalakoy, ancient Semena, had always known about walls and steps disappearing straight into the water at Kakova, but treated the site as an unremarkable, minor curiosity, a village edge worn away by waves like countless others along that coastline. Earthquakes in the 2nd century CE, part of the same seismic activity that reshaped much of the eastern Mediterranean, had dropped roughly half of Semena beneath the waterline, leaving building foundations, staircases, and cisterns visible just under the surface of the Kakova Sound, a fact confirmed only once Turkish authorities began systematic underwater documentation in the 20th century. Turkey has since designated the entire area a protected archaeological zone, banning diving directly over the ruins while permitting glass-bottom boat tours that let visitors trace the submerged staircases and building lines from the surface without disturbing a single stone. Samina's story isn't dramatic. That's what makes it useful. A quiet earthquake, an unremarkable coastal village, and a half-submerged street plan that sat in plain sight for 18 centuries because nobody thought to ask why the steps kept going after the water started. 17. Roman North Africa knew Neapolis, on the coast of modern Tunisia near Nabil, as a mid-sized port town known mostly for its garum production, the fermented fish sauce that flavored much of the empire's cooking. When large portions of the town vanished from the visible coastline, historians assumed ordinary coastal erosion had claimed a minor provincial settlement, not significant enough to warrant a dedicated search. A joint Tunisian-Italian survey team using multi-beam sonar between 2010 and the mid-2010s identified roughly 20 hectares of submerged ruins just off the Nabil coastline, including streets, monuments, and more than 100 vats used for producing garum, among the largest concentrations of fish sauce production infrastructure found anywhere in the former Roman world. Geological evidence points to a tsunami, likely tied to the same 365 CE earthquake that devastated Alexandria and the eastern Mediterranean more broadly, as the probable cause, submerging a working industrial waterfront in a single violent event rather than gradual erosion. Neapolis wasn't a footnote. It was one of Rome's biggest fish sauce factories, sitting under 6 meters of water, because the same earthquake that hit Alexandria also reached Tunisia's coast that night. 18. Medieval English records list Ravensor Odd as a genuine, thriving port on the Yorkshire coast near the mouth of the Humber, wealthy enough to send its own representatives to Parliament in the 1300s. By the time later historians went looking for it, the town had simply disappeared from every modern map, and for a long stretch it was treated more as a cautionary anecdote than a real place worth excavating, an object lesson about coastal erosion rather than an archaeological target. Contemporary chronicles describe repeated storm surges battering the town through the 1350s, culminating in a catastrophic flood around 1362, part of the same North Sea storm system that drowned Rungholt in Germany the same winter, which finished off what earlier storms had already weakened. Modern coastal geologists studying Spurn Point's shifting sandbanks have used historical maps, tax records, and sediment analysis to pin down Ravensor Odd's likely former location, now scattered somewhere beneath the Humber estuary's constantly moving sands, a site too unstable for the kind of fixed excavation done at Pavlopetri or Baye. Ravensor Odd sent MPs to Parliament and then vanished from the map entirely inside 2 generations. The Humber didn't erase a legend. It erased a functioning town, and the sand still hasn't given up exactly where. 19. Suffolk locals along England's eastern coast have talked for centuries about hearing church bells ringing beneath the waves near Dunwich, a once major medieval port that rivaled London in size before the sea began eating it away, building by building, over roughly 700 years. Victorian folklorists collected the bell stories as ghost lore, charming but dismissible, the kind of coastal legend every fishing town seems to grow eventually. Dunwich was, by any measure, a real and significant medieval city, home to multiple churches, a mint, and a substantial harbor, until relentless coastal erosion, worsened by a series of major storms in the 13th and 14th centuries, pulled the entire town into the North Sea piece by piece. University of Southampton researchers led by David Sear used sonar and diver surveys starting in the 2000s to map submerged building foundations and church remains scattered across the seabed off the current coastline, finally producing a physical layout to match centuries of oral tradition about where the old town had stood. The bells were never literal, but the churches under them were, and sonar finally drew the outline the ghost stories had been describing all along. 20. Breton legend tells of Yais, a magnificent city built below sea level and protected by dikes, ruled by King Gradlon, until his daughter Dahut supposedly opened the sea gates during a storm, and the entire city drowned in a single night as punishment for her sins. For centuries, Ys sat comfortably in the same folklore category as Atlantis, a moral fable about a decadent, ill-fated city, with no specific location anyone treated as worth surveying. Unlike most entries on this list, no confirmed archaeological site has ever been definitively matched to Ys. Some researchers have pointed to the Baie de Douarnenez off the Breton coast, where submerged stone alignments and ancient dike-like structures have been observed, but nothing conclusively dated or excavated as an actual city. What the region does have is real evidence of Bronze Age and Roman-era coastal settlements in the area, along with documented instances of significant coastal flooding across Breton history, suggesting the legend likely compressed multiple real, more modest events into one dramatic story about a single doomed metropolis. Ys stays the honest exception on this list. The coastline changed, the flooding was real, and the specific golden city with the sea gates has never been found, only borrowed from smaller, truer floods that actually happened. 21. Welsh oral tradition describes Contrir Gwaelod, the lowland hundred, a fertile kingdom that once stretched across what's now Cardigan Bay, protected by an embankment and a series of sluice gates, until a keeper named Scythenin got drunk and failed to close them during a storm, drowning the entire realm. Like Ys, it circulated for centuries purely as a morality tale about neglect and consequence, no fixed location attached. At extremely low tides, particularly after storms, submerged tree stumps and peat deposits become visible along the Cardigan Bay coastline near Borth and Innislas. Remnants of an ancient forest that geologists have confirmed was drowned by rising post-glacial sea levels between roughly 4,000 and 1,500 years before the present. Radiocarbon dating of the exposed timber, along with a stone causeway called Sarn Sinfilin extending out into the bay, has convinced coastal archaeologists that a real, gradually flooded landscape once existed where the legend places Contrir Gwaelod, even if the specific tale of Scythenin's negligence is almost certainly a later embellishment layered onto a real environmental memory. The drunk gatekeeper is probably fiction. The drowned forest under Cardigan Bay, dated tree by tree, is not. 22. Andean oral history around Lake Titicaca, straddling the border of Peru and Bolivia, described sunken temples and terraces somewhere beneath the lake's cold, deep water, tied to pre-Incan civilizations that predated the Inca Empire by centuries. Spanish colonial chroniclers recorded fragments of the tradition, but for most of the 20th century, Andean archaeology focused almost entirely on visible highland ruins, leaving the lakebed itself largely unexamined. A joint Bolivian-French archaeological expedition surveying Lake Titicaca's Sacred Bay, near the island known locally as Co, located a substantial underwater site in the early 2010s. Stone terracing, a ceremonial platform, gold and shell offerings, and a llama figurine crafted from a spondylus shell, indicating ritual activity by Tiwanaku culture priests roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. Rather than a single catastrophic flood, researchers concluded the site was likely built as a deliberate ceremonial platform, partly submerged from the start, tied to the lake's spiritual significance in pre-Incan cosmology, rather than a city that sank by accident. Titicaca's underwater terraces weren't drowned by disaster. They were placed there on purpose by people who considered the lake itself sacred, and it took a spondylus shell llama to prove the ritual was real. 23. Cuban fishermen and later a marine engineering survey crew reported unusual geometric shapes on the seabed off the western tip of Cuba, near the Guanahacaibes Peninsula, in the early 2000s. Formations some described as resembling pyramids, roads, and urban structures at a depth of roughly 650 meters. The claim spread fast in popular media, framed as a potential lost city, predating known civilizations in the region by thousands of years. Canadian marine engineer Pauline Zalitsky and her company ADC used sonar to detect the formations in 2001, and initial imagery did show large, unusually regular shapes on the ocean floor, enough to draw genuine attention from geologists as well as more speculative commentators. Subsequent scientific review has been considerably more skeptical. Marine geologists who examine the sonar data and later imagery generally conclude the formations are natural granite structures, shaped by tectonic and volcanic activity rather than construction, and no peer-reviewed excavation or verified artifact recovery has ever confirmed human origin. The Cuban formations are the clearest reminder on this list that sonar alone doesn't settle a myth. Straight lines on a seabed chart can come from a city or from a fault line, and this one, so far, has produced a fault line. 24. Local tradition along India's Coromandel coast near Mahabalipuram described 7 pagodas that once stood along the shore, 6 of which had been swallowed by the sea, leaving only the surviving shore temple visible to travelers. European visitors recorded the legend as early as the 17th century, generally treating it as an exaggerated fisherman's tale attached to a single, genuinely impressive temple. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami briefly pulled the shoreline back before the wave struck, exposing stone structures, including what appeared to be a collapsed wall and carved rock reliefs that residents had never seen before, prompting a formal archaeological and marine survey in the disaster's aftermath. Indian Navy divers working with the Archaeological Survey of India subsequently mapped submerged structures off the coast, including remains consistent with temple architecture and man-made stone blocks, lending credible physical support to a legend that had circulated as folklore for roughly 3 centuries beforehand. The tsunami that devastated the coast in 2004 also proved the 7 pagodas story right. It took a disaster to pull the water back far enough for anyone to finally see what the fishermen had been describing since the 1600s. 25. Egyptian priests told Herodotus about Meneuthis, a town near Canopus associated with a temple to Isis, but by the time European Egyptologists went looking centuries later, records of the site had grown so tangled with nearby Canopus and Thonis Heracleion that many 19th century scholars assumed Meneuthis was either a scribal duplication or a temple precinct too minor to warrant a separate search. Frank Gaudio's ongoing Abu Qir Bay surveys eventually identified Meneuthis as a distinct site, roughly a kilometer from Canopus, featuring its own temple foundations, statuary fragments, and votive objects tied specifically to Isis worship, confirming it as a genuine, separate settlement rather than an alternate name for a neighboring town. Coptic-era texts had also described Meneuthis as a late holdout of pagan worship, actively suppressed by Christian authorities in the 5th century, a detail that took on new weight once the physical temple remains were confirmed underwater, matching a written record of religious conflict to an actual excavated site. Meneuthis went from a footnote historians argued about to a mapped temple precinct with its own inventory of finds, sitting exactly where Herodotus said a temple to Isis ought to be. 26. German folklore along the Baltic coast preserved stories of Veneta, a fabulously wealthy trading city, sometimes described as rivaling Rome itself, that sank beneath the sea as punishment for its residents' arrogance and greed. A story that circulated in various forms from medieval chroniclers through 19th century Romantic poets who used it as shorthand for hubris and downfall. Several real locations along the Pomeranian coast, including the medieval trading port of Wolin in modern Poland, have been proposed by historians as the likely factual basis for the legend, given genuine archaeological evidence of a substantial Slavic and Viking-era trading settlement that thrived there roughly 1,000 years ago before declining, gradually, rather than sinking overnight. No excavation has ever recovered a specific submerged city matching Veneta's golden, doomed metropolis description, and most serious historians now treat it as a folkloric amplification of Wulin's real decline, likely compounded by memories of genuine Baltic storm flooding across the medieval period. Vanita, the golden, punished city, almost certainly never existed as described. Wulin, the real trading port the legend was probably built from, absolutely did, and its ruins are on land, not underwater, waiting for anyone willing to separate the myth from its source. 27. Russian Orthodox tradition tells of Kitezh, a city on the shore of Lake Svetloyar that became invisible, rather than physically sunk, when its residents prayed for protection from a Mongol invasion in the 13th century, with the lake itself said to swallow the city's reflection and hide it from view permanently. Unlike most entries on this list, the legend was never really framed as an archaeological claim. It was framed as a miracle, which kept serious researchers away from the lake for centuries. Soviet and later Russian scientific expeditions to Lake Svetloyar throughout the 20th century used sonar and diving surveys primarily to study the lake's unusual formation, generally concluding it originated from a karst sinkhole rather than any deliberate construction event, with no verified man-made structures located on the lakebed. Some researchers have noted wooden log remnants and structural fragments recovered from the lake in limited surveys, potentially consistent with medieval settlement activity somewhere along its shore, though nothing close to a submerged city has been confirmed. Kitezh is this list's clearest reminder that not every drowned city legend is actually about a drowned city. Sometimes the sea takes something. Sometimes the story was never about the water at all. 28. Dutch chroniclers recorded the loss of the town of Saftinghe in the Scheldt estuary near the modern Belgian-Dutch border during the St. Felix's flood of November 1530. A disaster so severe it permanently reshaped the regional coastline and drowned dozens of villages across Flanders and Zeeland in a single catastrophic tidal surge. Later, Dutch folklore dressed the loss up considerably, adding a cursed, ghost-haunted drowned land mythology that made the real historical flood harder to take at face value. Unlike most sites on this list, Saftinghe's drowning is extensively documented in contemporary 16th century Dutch and Flemish administrative records, tax rolls, and church registers, giving historians an unusually precise paper trail for a coastal disaster of that era, well before archaeology needed to fill in any gaps. Modern surveys of the Verdronken land van Saftinghe mudflats, now a protected nature reserve, have located building foundations, dike remnants, and church ruins consistent with the medieval settlement, confirmed against the same tax and parish records that first reported the flood nearly 5 centuries ago. Saftinghe didn't need sonar to prove it. It needed someone to stop treating a 16th century tax record as less credible than a ghost story about a drowned land. 29. Micronesian oral tradition on Pohnpei describes Nan Madol, a sprawling complex of nearly 100 artificial islets built from massive basalt logs, as the work of twin sorcerers who levitated the stones into place using magic. A legend European and American visitors in the 19th and early 20th centuries generally treated as decorative folklore layered over ruins they assumed were simpler than they actually were. Nan Madol sits partially, submerged in a lagoon off Pohnpei's eastern shore, constructed from columnar basalt blocks, some weighing several tons, stacked in a log cabin style across an artificial canal system that early surveyors initially underestimated, both in scale and in the engineering it would have taken to move that much stone without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools. Modern archaeological dating places the bulk of construction between roughly 1200 and 1500 CE, tied to the Saudeleur dynasty that once ruled Pohnpei, with ongoing UNESCO-supported research still working to determine exactly how the builders transported and placed basalt columns weighing up to 50 tons across open water. Nan Madol's builders didn't have sorcerers. They had a tidal lagoon, decades of labor, and an engineering solution nobody outside Pohnpei has fully reverse engineered even now. 30. Cornish and Breton fishing communities on both sides of the English Channel shared versions of a legend about Lyonesse, a rich kingdom said to have stretched between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly before drowning in a single catastrophic flood, later folded into Arthurian legend as the land where Tristan was born. For centuries, the story was treated purely as Arthurian romance, decorative background for medieval poets rather than a real geography anyone tried to survey. Modern bathymetric surveys of the waters between Land's End and the Scilly Isles have confirmed the seabed there is genuinely shallow and geologically consistent with dry land, as recently as a few thousand years ago, part of the broader post-glacial sea level rise that also created Doggerland further north and east. No confirmed city, walls, or building foundations matching Lyonesse's legendary scale have ever been located on the seabed, and most archaeologists now treat the specific kingdom as pure medieval invention layered onto a real, gradually drowned landscape, similar to the Iez and Veneta patterns seen earlier on this list. The land Lyonesse supposedly stood on was real, and it did go underwater. The castle, the kingdom, and Tristan's birthplace were added afterward, by storytellers filling in a coastline the sea had already taken. 31. Every city on this list, real, contested, or half-invented, sits on the same geological fact. Sea levels have never stopped moving, and the coastline your grandparents grew up on is not the coastline your grandchildren will inherit. Pavlopetri went under from tectonic subsidence over centuries. Doggerland went under from a tsunami in an afternoon. Rungholt and Ravensor Odd went under in the same storm, 400 miles apart, in the same brutal winter of 1362. Marine archaeologists studying this pattern today, from Frank Gaudio's ongoing work in Abu Qir Bay to coastal geologists mapping Cardigan Bay's drowned forest, aren't just cataloging the past. Modern climate researchers use the same sediment cores, the same subsidence data, and in some cases the exact same coastlines to model how quickly today's ports could face a similar fate, with several studies projecting portions of Venice, Jakarta, and Miami dealing with regular tidal flooding well within this century. The pattern across 31 cities never changed. A community builds where the water is convenient. The water, eventually, renegotiates the terms. The only real variable is how long it takes anyone afterward to stop calling the drowned street plan a legend and start calling it a survey. 31 cities, 31 dismissals, one pattern. The tavern story was never the problem. The problem was always waiting too long to send a diver to check. If you had to pick the one find on this list that should have been taken seriously decades before anyone actually looked, drop the number in the comments. And if drowned cities aren't strange enough for you, Relic Vault has entire episodes on the artifacts museums kept in storage rooms for decades before anyone dared publish them. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.